The valley breathed the way it always had, slow and patient, like an old witness that had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Wind slid through the tall grass and bent it in waves as if the earth itself was remembering something it had tried to forget. The mountains stood wide and watchful, their shadows stretching long across the dirt road that cut through the land. A single stagecoach appeared in the distance, its wooden wheels crying against stone and dust, announcing a return that would not go unnoticed in this wild western tale. She sat inside the coach with her gloved hands folded tight in her lap, feeling every mile in her bones. Each jolt of the road stirred memories she had buried beneath years of distance and survival. She had left this place as a girl with hope in her chest and fear at her heels, and now she came back as a woman carrying the weight of all she had endured. The smell of sagebrush and sun-baked earth slipped through the open window and wrapped around her like an old song she never truly forgot. The driver slowed as the valley opened wide before them, revealing scattered ranch houses, split rail fences, and the distant line of cottonwoods. Near the creek, time had worn everything thinner, but it had not erased it. The land remembered, and so did she. Every turn of the wheel pulled her closer to the life she had abandoned and the one man she never allowed herself to name aloud, even in her loneliest nights away. Down near the far pasture, a cowboy stood astride a dark horse, repairing a fence post that had leaned too long. His hands were rough, steady, and marked by years of labor. When the wind shifted, he paused, not knowing why. His chest tightened as if a door long sealed inside him had creaked open. He lifted his eyes toward the road, and though distance blurred the shape of the coach, something in his blood told him the waiting was over. He had grown up in this valley, shaped by hard winters and harder lessons. Words were never safe where he came from. Silence kept you fed, kept you breathing, kept you standing when others fell. He learned early that feelings were liabilities, and promises could break a man faster than a bullet. So he buried everything deep beneath routine and work, beneath the wide brim of his hat and the quiet way he moved through the world. The town felt her arrival before she ever reached the first building. Dogs barked, doors shifted, and faces appeared behind curtains. Names whispered across porches. Some remembered the girl who left with dust in her hair and fire in her eyes. Others remembered the trouble that followed after she was gone. The valley had never truly settled after that, and her return stirred the old unease like a hand dragged through still water. As the coach rolled to a stop, she stepped down slowly, her boots meeting the soil that once felt like home. The ground was firm, familiar, and unforgiving. She straightened her coat and drew a breath, steadying herself against the pull of memory. The sky stretched endlessly above her, the same sky she once watched beside a boy who never spoke his heart, but showed it in the way he stayed near, even when he should have ridden away. He watched from afar, unseen by her, yet unable to turn away. The sight of her standing there, framed by dust and sunlight, struck him harder than any storm. Years collapsed in his chest, bringing back the night he chose silence over truth, believing it was the only way to protect them both. The secret he carried since childhood stirred awake, restless and demanding, as if it knew it could no longer remain buried. Horses shifted in their stalls, the wind carried the creak of old signs, and somewhere a bell rang, marking a moment that would change the course of lives. This was not just a return, it was a reckoning. The valley had waited patiently for this crossing of paths, knowing that some stories cannot end until the truth is finally faced. In this wild old Western story, the land does not forget, and neither do the hearts shaped by it. Her arrival was only the beginning, a spark cast into dry grass. Silence would soon break, promises would be tested, and the cowboy who learned to survive without words would be forced to confront the one truth he had never allowed himself to speak. The sun lowered itself behind the ridge and laid a copper glow across the valley, as if the land wished to soften what was coming. She walked the length of the main street, feeling every stair brush against her back. Some were curious, some were guarded, some carried old judgment like a scar never healed. The wooden boards beneath her boots groaned in recognition, and each sound echoed through her chest. She passed the general store, the old saloon, the church with its leaning cross, all unchanged yet altered by time and memory in this wild western tale. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and murmured voices. The moment she stepped through the swinging doors, the sound thinned like breath held too long. Men paused mid-drink, cards stilled, and even the piano lost its rhythm. She did not look for him, yet she felt him there, the way one feels a storm before the clouds gather. Her presence unsettled the room, not because she was unwelcome, but because she reminded them all of something unfinished. He stood near the back, half hidden by shadow, an instinct. His hat was low, his shoulders stiff, as if bracing for a blow. He had sworn he would not come, sworn he would keep his distance like he always had. But the pull was stronger than discipline, stronger than fear. He watched the way she moved, steady and proud, carrying pain with grace, and it broke something open inside him that had been sealed since boyhood. She ordered coffee and took a seat near the window, her hands warming around the cup. Though the night was not cold, she listened to the low sounds of the room, the scrape of boots, the clink of glass, the soft lies people told themselves to get through another day. This place had once been her refuge and her prison, and now it felt like a crossroads waiting for her to choose which truth she would face. Their eyes met without warning and without mercy. The years between them vanished, leaving only the raw present. He felt his breath catch, and she felt the old ache stir awake. Neither smiled, neither looked away. In that silent exchange lived every word never spoken, every choice made out of fear and love twisted together like rope. The valley itself seemed to lean closer, as if demanding to hear what they would not yet say. He turned first, not out of strength but survival, and stepped outside into the cooling air. The sky had darkened to deep blue, and the first stars trembled to life. He leaned against the hitching post, gripping the wood until his knuckles burned. He told himself he was still that boy who learned that silence was safety, but the truth clawed louder, now refusing to be ignored. She followed moments later, the saloon doors sighing behind her. She stopped a few steps away, giving him space as she always had, respecting the walls he built so carefully. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dust, leather, and the past. She spoke his name softly, and the sound of it cut deeper than any blade. He closed his eyes, because hearing it from her lips made the years feel wasted and heavy. They spoke of small things, first of the road, of weather, of the land, as if circling a wound, afraid to touch it directly. Each word felt fragile, like dry grass ready to ignite. She told him she had not planned to return, yet the valley called her back in dreams and sleepless nights. He said nothing, but his silence no longer felt empty. It trembled with everything he had never confessed. Around them the town settled into night lamps, glowing low, horses shifting in their pens. Somewhere a coyote cried, and the sound carried long and lonely across the plains. He remembered being a boy beside her near the creek, promising himself he would protect her by staying quiet, by staying strong. He believed love meant endurance, not honesty, and that belief shaped every step he took away from her. She told him she left because waiting became too painful, because she needed air beyond unspoken things. Her voice did not accuse it, simply stated a truth long denied. He felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, heavier than any saddle. He realized then that silence had not spared them, it had only delayed the reckoning. Now, standing between them under the vast western sky, this wild old western story was no longer about return, but about confrontation, not with guns or fists, but with memory and truth. The valley held its breath, knowing the night was far from over, and that dawn would not come without cost. What had been buried for years stirred restlessly inside the cowboy, and for the first time he wondered if survival had demanded too much from his heart. The storm did not break that afternoon, yet its presence lingered heavy in the air, pressing down on the valley like an unspoken warning. Clouds rolled slow and dark above the ridges, casting long moving shadows across the land. In this wild western tale, even the sky seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for a choice to be made. They parted at the creek without promises, without certainty, only with the shared understanding that something had shifted. He walked back toward the open range, leading his horse beside him, while she returned to town, each step echoing louder than the last. The space between them no longer felt empty, it felt charged like dry earth before rain. Word traveled quickly in a place like this, not through clear sentences, but through glances and pauses. People noticed the cowboy riding later than usual that evening, and the woman lingering longer by the general store window. The valley had its own way of spreading truth, even when no one spoke it aloud. By nightfall, lanterns glowed across town, and the saloon filled with low, uneasy voices. Old rivalries stirred alongside old memories. A rancher named Halle sat near the bar, his eyes sharp and watchful. He had long believed the valley belonged to men who took what they wanted, and he had never forgiven the cowboy for standing in his way years ago when land and cattle were at stake. Halle recognized her the moment she walked past the saloon doors. He remembered the trouble that followed her departure, and the quiet strength of the man who never fought him openly but never backed down either. Seeing her return lit a spark of resentment that had waited patiently for its moment. The cowboy felt it too, the shift in the air, the sense that the past was circling back sharper than before. He tied his horse near the edge of town and stood still for a long moment, listening. The sounds of laughter and music from the saloon rang hollow like a challenge. He knew that secrets once stirred rarely stayed contained. Inside the saloon, Halle spoke loudly enough for others to hear, words coded in mockery and suggestion. He spoke of land disputes reopening and old claims being questioned. His gaze flicked toward the door where she might appear, and his smile carried no warmth. The room grew tense because everyone knew what old Western stories taught, that silence before conflict was never peaceful. She heard the tone before the words as she approached the saloon and paused just outside. She did not step in yet. She listened, recognizing the danger woven into casual insults. The valley had shaped men like Halle just as it shaped the cowboy, but in very different ways. One buried pain while the other sharpened it into a weapon. The cowboy entered, then not with aggression but with calm resolve. He took a place near the wall, his presence alone enough to still the room. Halle turned, slowly meeting his eyes, and for a moment the years fell away, leaving two men bound by unfinished business. The woman remained outside, unseen yet deeply felt. Halle accused him of hiding behind silence, of letting others fight his battles, of pretending to be something noble while claiming more land than he deserved. The words were bait meant to force a reaction. The cowboy felt the familiar urge to retreat inward, to let quiet be his shield, but the memory of the creek and her steady gaze held him in place. He answered not with anger but truth. He spoke of boundaries drawn fairly and promises kept even when they cost him. He spoke louder than he ever had before, and the sound of his own voice surprised him. The saloon listened, because this was a man who rarely spoke unless it mattered. Halle laughed, but the laughter rang thin. The challenge was set, and everyone felt it. The valley had reached a turning point where avoidance would no longer hold. This wild old Western story was shifting from memory into action, and the cost would soon be demanded. Outside, the woman sensed the change like a tremor beneath her feet. She stepped into the lamplit street, her posture steady. Despite the storm building overhead, she had not returned to be silent again, and she would not allow old fears to decide her fate. The town watched as she stood waiting, neither interfering nor retreating. When the cowboy finally stepped back into the night, his face was set with a resolve she had never seen before. He did not look at Halle again. He walked toward her, and for the first time in years did not hesitate before stopping at her side. The valley seemed to exhale around them. He told her quietly that the past was no longer content to stay buried, that choices would have to be made soon. She nodded because she already knew. In wild Western tales, love was never separate from consequence, and standing together often meant standing against the storm. Thunder rolled distant and low, promising what was to come. They did not touch yet. Their closeness spoke volumes, the secret that had lived inside the cowboy since childhood pressed harder now, no longer content with partial truth. The valley listened, the town waited, and the night stretched long, knowing that by the next dawn silence would no longer be an option. Morning came slow and pale, brushing the valley with a quiet light that felt uncertain rather than peaceful. The land looked calm, yet everything beneath it stirred with tension, like a river hiding a strong current beneath a smooth surface. In this wild Western tale, dawn did not bring comfort. It brought questions that had waited too long to be asked. The cowboy rose before the sun, as he always did, but this morning his routine offered no shelter. He saddled his horse with steady hands, yet his mind wandered back to the sound of her voice saying his name the way it once did, soft but unafraid. He rode out toward the open range, believing distance might settle him, but the valley only echoed her presence louder with every step his horse took. She woke in the small rented room above the general store, listening to the boards creak as the building stretched. Awake, the ceiling felt lower than she remembered, and the walls carried whispers of nights long gone. She sat up and pressed her palm to her chest, steadying herself against the weight of unfinished truths. Returning had opened doors she once nailed shut, and now there was no turning away. Outside, the town moved slowly. Men spoke in half sentences, and women paused longer than usual during their chores. Everyone sensed that something old had returned, something that belonged to the valley as much as the soil and wind in wild old Western stories. The land often knows before the people do, and this place was no different. By mid-morning she walked toward the creek, where cottonwoods cast broken shadows across the water. The path was familiar, worn by memory more than feet. She remembered laughter, their secrets shared without words, and the feeling that life was wide and waiting. Back then she believed silence meant safety. Now she understood it had only postponed the pain. He arrived later leading his horse rather than riding it, a sign of respect and hesitation. He stopped when he saw her by the water, her reflection trembling beside his own in the slow-moving current. The creek had been their quiet place once, and stepping into it again felt like trespassing on something sacred. They stood apart at first, letting the sound of water fill the space between them. The cowboy broke the silence with a simple greeting, his voice rough from years of restraint. She answered with a nod, her eyes never leaving his face. There was no anger there, only a steady resolve that made his chest tighten. He spoke of the land of fences that needed mending and cattle that wandered too far west. He spoke because talking about work was easier than admitting fear. She listened patiently, understanding the language of avoidance better than anyone. When he paused, she asked him why he never stopped her from leaving. The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of every night she spent wondering. His breath left him slow and heavy. He told her he believed she deserved more than a man who could not speak what lived inside him. He believed letting her go was an act of protection, not abandonment. The words tasted bitter as he said them because hearing them aloud revealed how small they sounded compared to the years they cost. She stepped closer, then close enough that he could see the lines time had drawn around her eyes. She told him that love without truth had felt like standing in the shade forever, waiting for the sun. She said leaving was the only way she knew how to survive. Those words struck him harder than blame ever could. The wind rose, suddenly lifting dust and leaves around them as if the valley itself reacted to their honesty. In this wild western tale, nature was never separate from the heart, and the land seemed restless. With every truth uncovered, the cowboy felt the old secret stir deeper than before, pressing against his chest, demanding release. He confessed then not everything, but enough to change the shape of the moment. He spoke of his childhood, of lessons learned too early about loss and restraint. He told her he had promised himself never to need anyone the way he once needed a family that vanished too soon. His silence was armor forged from grief, not indifference. She listened without interrupting, understanding that this was his first real step forward. When he finished, she reached out and touched his hand, a simple gesture that carried more forgiveness than words could hold. He did not pull away this time, he stayed. From the ridge above, the creek clouds gathered thick and dark. A storm was building, the kind that arrives without warning and leaves the land changed. Behind them, the town waited, sensing that whatever happened by the water would ripple outward, touching every life tied to the valley. This part of the wild old western story did not end with answers or reunion. It ended with something more dangerous, honesty beginning to take root. The cowboy looked at her, then truly looked, and realized the secret he carried since childhood could no longer survive in silence. The valley watched as two lives stood on the edge of truth, knowing that once spoken, nothing would ever return to the way it was before. Night settled heavy over the valley, and the storm finally began to move closer. Its presence felt in the way the wind pushed harder against doors and lifted dust from the road. Lantern light trembled along the street as if unsure whether to stand firm or surrender to the dark. In this wild western tale, the night did not bring rest, it brought reckoning. The cowboy walked her back toward the general store, neither of them speaking, yet both aware that silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer a shield, but a warning. Every step echoed with the knowledge that the valley was shifting and that the past had risen fully awake. He stopped before the steps and turned to face her, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face for something he could not name. She asked him what Halle truly wanted, not just land or pride, but the deeper hunger that drove a man to stir old wounds. The cowboy answered slowly, saying, Halle wanted dominance over the valley and proof that fear still ruled here. He admitted that years ago he had stopped Halle from taking more than his share, and had done so quietly without witnesses or praise. That act of resistance had planted a seed of hatred that never died. The wind rose sharply, carrying the first cold drops of rain. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and listened closely. He continued, telling her that the secret he carried since childhood was not only about love but about survival. He had learned young that drawing attention invited loss, so he learned to stand firm without noise, to fight without spectacle. That habit saved his life more than once, but it cost him his voice. She looked at him, then truly looked, seeing the boy he once was behind the man shaped by dust and discipline. She told him that silence might have protected him, but it had left her alone in the dark. Believing she was unwanted, her words did not accuse, they revealed, and that made them heavier. Thunder rolled closer now, and the valley answered with a long, low echo. Horses shifted nervously and shutters rattled along the street. Townsfolk retreated indoors, sensing that something was unfolding beyond their control. In wild old Western stories, storms often arrive when truth is about to break free, and this night followed that rule. A rider appeared at the edge of town, moving fast through the rain, bringing news that Halle had gathered men and was riding the south fence line, claiming disputed ground. The message spread quickly, igniting fear and anger in equal measure. The cowboy felt the choice settle before him, clear and unavoidable. He could stay silent and lose everything, or speak fully and risk more than land. He turned to her and told her the truth he had never shared with anyone. He confessed that, when they were young, he planned to leave the valley with her to build something new beyond the reach of old rules. On the night he meant to ask her, a fire swept through his childhood home, taking the last of his family with it. He stayed behind out of duty and grief, believing he had nothing left to offer her. The rain fell harder, now soaking the street and washing dust into dark streams. She listened with tears mixing into the storm, realizing that the distance between them had been shaped by tragedy rather than indifference. The secret he buried since childhood was finally spoken aloud, and the sound of it felt like a crack of lightning through the years. She reached for him this time, and he did not resist. Her hand found his arm steady and warm, despite the cold rain. She told him that knowing the truth did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. She said that running had not freed her from the valley, it had only taught her how deeply she belonged to it and to him. Shouts rose from the far end of town as riders moved to respond to Halle. The cowboy stepped back, knowing what he had to do. He told her he would not hide anymore, not from Halle, not from the valley, and not from her. He said that whatever came next would be faced openly, even if it cost him everything. In the heart of this wild Western tale, courage was not found in gunfire alone, but in standing visible after a lifetime of retreat. The cowboy mounted his horse, reins streaming down his hat brim, and rode toward the gathering men. His posture was different, now no longer folded inward, but upright and unyielding. She watched him go, her heart heavy yet steady, knowing that this moment marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. The vanguard around them, rain soaking the earth as if cleansing it of old silence. Every fence, every ridge, every shadow bore witness to a truth long denied. As the riders disappeared into the storm, the woman remained on the porch, breathing deep and slow. She understood now that love in the wild old West was never gentle or simple. It demanded endurance, honesty, and the willingness to be seen even when fear whispered otherwise. The night stretched on, charged and restless. The secret that once lived hidden inside a quiet cowboy now rode openly into the storm, and the valley waited, knowing that by morning nothing would remain unchanged. The storm carried the riders into the open range, where rain cut sideways and the night swallowed distance. Horses pushed forward through mud, and when their breath rising hard and white in the dark, the cowboy rode at the front, not because he claimed command, but because his resolve pulled him there. In this wild Western tale, courage moved first and explanation followed later. They reached the south fence line, where lantern light flickered in shadows. Twisted across the ground, Halle stood with his men boots planted wide, confidence worn like a badge. He believed the storm favored him, believing chaos always rewarded the loudest voice. The cowboy dismounted slowly, rein sliding from his coat, and stepped forward alone, letting the space speak before he did. The men watched closely, sensing that this moment held more weight than land or cattle. The wind tore at hats and cloaks, yet no one moved to interfere. Halle spoke, first mocking restraint, mistaking calm for weakness. He demanded submission, demanded silence, demanded that the valley remember who held power. The cowboy answered with words clear and steady, carried by the storm rather than swallowed by it. He spoke of boundaries drawn with fairness and blood spilled to protect them. He spoke of nights spent guarding land that fed families beyond his own. He spoke of standing quiet, not out of fear, but out of discipline, and the men listened because truth sounds different than noise. Rain drummed harder, as if the sky itself leaned in. Halle interrupted, laughing, yet his voice wavered. He accused the cowboy of hiding behind decency while denying others their due. The accusation hung in the air, waiting for the response that would decide everything. The cowboy took another step forward and did something he had never done before. He spoke not just of land, but of loss. He spoke of fire and childhood, and a promise he never kept because grief taught him to lock his heart away. He spoke of the woman who returned and the silence that cost them years. He admitted his failures openly, and the admission stripped the moment bare. In wild old Western stories, honesty often disarms more than weapons, and this night followed that rule. Some of Hale's men shifted, uncomfortably recognizing pieces of themselves in the words. Hale scowled, sensing control slip through his fingers like wet earth. The cowboy finished by saying the valley belonged to those willing to stand for it openly, not those who took advantage. In shadow, he said he would defend what was right, not quietly anymore, but where all could see. The storm answered with a roar, and the moment broke. Hale reached for his gun, but hesitated because the men behind him did not follow. Some stepped back, others lowered their eyes. The power Hale relied on fractured under the weight of truth. He cursed and then turned away, retreating into the rain with only a few riders trailing behind. The cowboy stood, breathing hard, rain soaking him through, yet his chest felt lighter than it ever had. The men remaining nodded in respect, not cheering, not speaking, but acknowledging the shift the valley had chosen, and it had done so without blood. Dawn crept slow and gray by the time he rode back toward town. Mud clung to his boots and exhaustion settled deep in his bones, yet his posture remained upright. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and quiet. She waited where lantern light faded into morning, watching the road with steady patience. When she saw him emerge from the mist, her breath caught. He dismounted and walked toward her, every step unburdened by the weight he once carried. They stood together as the sun broke through clouds, touching the valley with new light. He told her it was over, not because he won, but because he finally spoke. She smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but true, and that was enough. In this wild Western tale, the ending was not a grand departure or a perfect reunion. It was a beginning shaped by honesty and choice. The valley rested easy, knowing that silence no longer ruled here. The cowboy looked across the land that raised him and nearly broke him, and felt something unfamiliar. Hope he had learned that strength did not live in what was hidden, but in what was shared. And as the morning stretched wide before them, the words he once buried rode free, at last carried by wind across a valley that would remember them forever.